Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Always good to have you back, and I do echo what Senator McCain said. I hope you come back more often and share with us your thoughts. Let me let you be explicit on the issue of Bashar Assad, because I hear and I read in the paper, for example, December 7, Bloomberg said Obama no longer seems sure Assad should go. Is that true? Do you believe that Mr. Assad should explicitly be removed from power, or is there a growing feeling that perhaps we ought to team up with Assad?
I think, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think what Secretary Kerry is trying to engineer is the departure of Assad in a way that everyone can support, which, by the way, includes the Russians, who have a lot of influence with Assad. So it's important to see if you can get them on the right side of history here, and that accomplishes that, and this is important, quite apart from the atrocities that Assad has committed, in a way that removes him while the structures of the Syrian state are still relatively intact. Because, to get back to what Senator King was saying a moment ago, we do need there to be, after Assad, a government of Syria that is inclusive, that involves the forces that have been fighting each other, fighting ISIL and governing the territory decently. That is exactly, pardon me, the transition that Secretary Kerry is working on.
Much like we needed in Iraq after the successful invasion. I think I understand what you're saying, but let's get your testimony on this. To your knowledge, is the President still resolute in saying that Assad should go, and that a solution is not that we should begin to work with him?
No, a political transition in which Assad leaves power and is replaced by a more inclusive form of government is the outcome that we're trying to see.
And a political solution in which Assad stays in power, is that acceptable to you?
I think no.
And is it acceptable to the President?
Well, what Secretary Kerry is trying to arrange is not.
I understand what your testimony just was, but we need to get this on the record, and the Americans need an answer to this. Is the President steadfast in having a goal that includes Mr. Assad being removed from power?
Well, that's the path that he has. That's the kind of political transition that he has Secretary of Kerry seeking, yes.
Would you agree that it would be very difficult to convince Syrian rebels to fight only ISIS and not Assad, if that were a direction in which the administration should?
We actually have experience in exactly that matter. And
what is your experience?
The experience is that it's easier to find fighters who are intent upon fighting Assad than to find ones that are intent upon fighting ISIL.
Do you believe Mr. Assad should be removed from power?
Yeah, I think that to have a decent government there that brings the moderate opposition into governance there is going to require the departure of Assad. The how, the when, the where, and so forth is something that Secretary Kerry is negotiating.
Yeah,
you know, the Civil War has gone on a long time, and he's been a lightning rod in that Civil War. And if we want to get it behind us and defeat ISIL and get peace in Syria, I think that's going to be necessary. Yeah.
Well, very good. I may try to follow up with some questions on the record there. Let me ask you about no-fly zones. I understand we've had some testimony today about safe zones. And I'll ask you first, Mr. Secretary, and then if you want to ask the General to add his thoughts, that would be good. Safe zone, no-fly zones would allow Syrians to stay in their own country instead of seeking to become refugees anywhere. They would allow Syrian opposition leaders to exercise sovereignty over Syrian territory. Do you and our coalition partners have the pilots, personnel, and equipment required to establish no-fly zones? And in particular, I think maybe earlier while I was out of the room, there was an attempt to get you to discuss the coalition partners that might be able to enforce this. And do you believe President Putin would challenge our air dominance there and the clearly defined no-fly zones that we would be seeking to enforce? First, you, Secretary Carter.
Sure. On no-fly zones, that's something that I've discussed for the committee before. That's not a step we have recommended, again, because the benefits don't warrant it in light of the costs. I can explain more, but I'm going to ask General Sullivan, who's done a lot of work on that kind of thing, to comment further. And with respect to the Russians also, he can comment on the memorandum of understanding there and the working relationship we have with the Russian military in the air over Syria right now.
Fair enough. General.
Senator, we have the military capacity to impose a no-fly zone. The question that we need to ask is, do we have the political and policy backdrop with which to do so? And I don't mean that in the case of our government, but in the case of the governments who would challenge the no-fly zone. So if we're asking the question, could we do it, the answer is yes. Are we willing to engage the potential of a conflict, a direct conflict, with the Syrian integrated air defense system or Syrian forces, or by corollary, a miscalculation with the Russians, should they choose to contest the no-fly zone? And those are the questions that have been posed, asked, and answered. And so military capacity, we have the capacity to do this. We have not recommended it because the political situation on the ground and the potential for miscalculation and loss of American life in the air in an attempt to defend the no-fly zone don't warrant the no-fly zone, given the fact that on the ground the forces would still contest the safe zone on the ground.
Well, I'm way over my time, but let me just say that the Secretary mentioned the cost and benefit. And when I think of the benefit that we could have had in the United States not to be faced with this refugee crisis, the benefit to Europe if we had given Syrians a place where they could live in their own country safely away from these barrel bombs and these attacks on civilians, it just seems to me that the benefit of doing so, even now, but certainly having done so over time, would have been so enormous that it would have justified whatever cost we might have had to risk. So thank you very much for your answers, and I appreciate the Chair indulging me.